On a dark summer night in 1945, four Japanese bomber crews climbed into their planes feeling safe and confident. These men had flown many night missions before and always returned home safely because darkness had always protected them like an invisible shield. They believed that American fighters could not find them in the black sky, that the night belonged to Japan, and that they would drop their bombs and escape before anyone could stop them. But something was already waiting for them in that darkness, something they had heard whispered about but refused to believe was real. Within 80 minutes, all four bombers would be gone, torn apart by an invisible hunter that could see through the night itself. The Japanese crews never knew what hit them, never saw the black shape that stalked them through the clouds, never understood that the rules of night combat had changed forever. This is the story of the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the radar-equipped night fighter that shattered Japan's control of the dark Pacific skies, and the incredible mission that finally proved to every doubting Japanese officer that the Americans had created a weapon that turned darkness from friend into deadly enemy. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese bomber crews owned the night sky like kings owned their kingdoms. After the sun went down, Japanese planes could fly wherever they wanted, attack whatever targets they chose, and return home safely while American forces stood helpless on the ground below. American soldiers and sailors learned to fear the darkness because that was when the Japanese bombers came, dropping their deadly loads on airfields, supply dumps, and troop positions, while anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the black sky, almost never hitting anything. The problem was simple, but seemed impossible to solve. Human eyes cannot see well in darkness, and airplane pilots in those days had no way to find enemy planes at night unless they got lucky enough to spot an exhaust flame, or unless the enemy plane flew directly in front of the moon. American fighter pilots who tried to chase Japanese bombers at night usually just flew around in circles until their fuel ran low, never finding their targets and sometimes crashing because flying in total darkness was incredibly dangerous even without an enemy shooting at you. Japanese pilots had trained hard for night operations and had become experts at navigating in darkness, but their biggest advantage was simply that the Americans had no effective way to fight back after sunset. The psychological damage from these night raids was terrible for American morale. Soldiers never knew when Japanese bombers might appear overhead, and the feeling of helplessness made brave men feel afraid and frustrated. Commanders knew they had to find a solution to the night fighting problem if they wanted to protect their bases and eventually win the war. Traditional fighter planes were not the answer, because even the best pilot in the world could not find an enemy in pitch darkness without some way to see beyond what human eyes could see. What was needed was a completely new kind of aircraft built specifically for fighting at night, with special equipment that could detect enemy planes in darkness and with enough firepower to destroy them quickly before they could escape back into the protective shadows. American engineers and scientists began working on this problem even before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, but creating such an aircraft would take years of work and would require technologies that barely existed in the early 1940s. The aircraft that would eventually hunt down four Japanese bombers in 80 minutes started as drawings on paper in the offices of the Northrop Corporation in California. Engineers faced an enormous challenge because they had to design a plane that could do many things that seemed to contradict each other. It needed to be fast enough to catch bombers, but also needed to carry heavy equipment and fly for many hours, which usually made planes slow. It needed powerful weapons, but also needed to fly smoothly and steadily, so delicate radar equipment would work properly. The design that Jack Northrop and his team created was unlike any fighter plane that had ever been built before. The P-61 Black Widow had two large engines mounted in pods on either side of the central body, giving it the power it needed while also creating a unique twin-boom tail design that left the nose area free for radar equipment. The plane was huge compared to normal fighters, with a wingspan over 60 feet wide. But this size was necessary to carry everything needed for night fighting, including a crew of 3 men, large fuel tanks for long missions, and the heaviest armament of any American fighter. The weapons on the Black Widow were designed to destroy enemy bombers quickly and completely. 4 20mm cannons were mounted in the belly where the pilot could aim them, and these guns could fire explosive shells that would tear apart any bomber in just a few seconds of accurate shooting. The plane also had 4 50 caliber machine guns in a turret on top, though these were later removed from many aircraft to save weight. The 20mm cannons were the main weapons, and they were absolutely devastating when they hit a target. Each cannon could fire about 400 rounds per minute, which meant all 4 together could pump out over 1,600 explosive shells every 60 seconds. A pilot only needed to keep his finger on the trigger for 3 or 4 seconds to send dozens of shells into an enemy bomber, and that was usually more than enough to cause fatal damage. The shells would explode inside the enemy plane, cutting through metal, breaking vital parts, rupturing fuel tanks, and often causing the entire aircraft to explode in a fireball that could be seen for miles. But the most important part of the Black Widow was not its guns or its engines. The most important part was the radar system in its nose that could detect other aircraft in total darkness. This radar was called the SCR-720, and it worked by sending out radio waves that bounced off metal objects like airplanes and came back to be detected by the radar receiver. A skilled radar operator could see blips on a small glowing screen that showed where enemy planes were, even though they were completely invisible to human eyes. The radar could detect large bombers from 5 miles away or even farther under good conditions, giving the Black Widow crew plenty of time to position themselves for an attack. Operating the radar required special training and a lot of practice, because the screen also showed confusing returns from the ground and from clouds. But experienced radar operators learned to tell the difference between real targets and false signals. The radar operator would sit behind the pilot and guide him by calling out directions like turn left or climb higher until the P-61 was close enough for the pilot to either see the target with his own eyes or to get so close that missing would be almost impossible. Creating the Black Widow was only half the battle. The other half was training crews who could use this complex aircraft effectively in the dangerous conditions of night combat. The men selected to fly the P-61 were experienced pilots who had already proven themselves capable and steady under pressure. They needed hundreds of hours of practice flying on instruments alone, because night fighting meant flying in total darkness where you could not see the horizon or the ground and had to trust your instruments completely to tell you if you were flying level or turning or climbing or diving. Many good pilots who were excellent in daylight struggled with instrument flying because it felt unnatural to ignore what your body was telling you and trust what the gauges showed instead. Night fighting also required perfect teamwork between the pilot and the radar operator, 2 men who had to work together so smoothly that they almost thought like one person. The pilot could not see the enemy until the very last moment, so he had to trust completely in the radar operator's directions, even when those directions seemed wrong or when his instincts told him to do something different. Training missions involved hundreds of hours of practice interceptions, where P-61 crews would hunt American bombers playing the role of enemy aircraft. The crews learned to track targets on radar, learned to judge distances in darkness, learned to position their aircraft for the perfect firing angle, and learned to shoot accurately when they could barely see their target. One of the hardest skills was judging range at night, because normal visual clues did not work in darkness. Pilots had to learn through experience when a target was close enough to shoot, but not so close that they might collide with it or get caught in the explosion when it blew up. They also had to learn to fire short bursts instead of holding the trigger down for long periods, both to save ammunition and to avoid being blinded by the bright muzzle flashes from their own guns. The training was exhausting and sometimes dangerous because flying at night always carried risks, but the crews that completed this training were among the most skilled specialists in the entire American military. They had learned to do something that most people thought was impossible: to hunt and kill enemy aircraft in complete darkness using technology and teamwork that gave them godlike powers to see what others could not see. The first P-61 Black Widows entered combat in Europe in early 1944, where they proved that the radar night fighting concept actually worked. Black Widow crews shot down German bombers and night fighters, demonstrating that American technology and training had finally solved the night fighting problem. But the Pacific theater was where the Black Widow was needed most desperately, because Japanese night bombing raids were causing serious problems for American forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean and islands. Getting Black Widows to the Pacific took time because the aircraft had to be shipped across the ocean and then assembled at forward bases where conditions were primitive and spare parts were hard to get. The first Pacific P-61 units began operations in the summer of 1944, flying from bases in New Guinea and the Philippines, where Japanese bombers had been raiding almost every night. The crews had to adapt to new challenges, including navigating over endless ocean, dealing with violent tropical storms, and learning the tactics and performance characteristics of Japanese bombers, which were different from German aircraft. Japanese intelligence knew about the P-61 because they had received reports from various sources, but most Japanese commanders did not believe these reports were accurate. The idea that Americans had radar so good it could find airplanes in total darkness seemed like science fiction to officers who understood how difficult night fighting had always been. Some Japanese bomber crews who survived encounters with Black Widows tried to report that American fighters had attacked them in complete darkness, but their intelligence officers sometimes did not believe them, thinking the pilots were making excuses or had just been unlucky. This disbelief would persist until overwhelming evidence made it impossible to deny that the Americans really had created a night fighter that could hunt in darkness as easily as day fighters hunted in sunlight. The stage was being set for a mission that would shatter Japanese confidence and prove beyond any doubt that the night sky was no longer a safe place for Japanese bombers. By mid-1945, American forces were closing in on Japan itself, but Japanese bombers continued to fly night missions against American bases, trying to slow down the American advance. Intelligence reports indicated that a Japanese bomber unit was planning increased night operations, and American commanders put their P-61 squadrons on high alert. One particular Black Widow crew had been flying exhausting night patrols for weeks, spending hours in the dark sky protecting important American facilities from Japanese attack. On this specific night, the crew took off shortly after sunset with full ammunition and enough fuel for about 4 hours of flying time. The crew consisted of a pilot with extensive experience, a radar operator who was one of the best in the squadron, and a gunner who served as an extra pair of eyes. They had flown together for months and trusted each other completely, which was essential for success in night combat, where teamwork meant the difference between life and death. The night was clear with scattered clouds and a quarter moon that gave just a little light, but not enough to help much with seeing other aircraft. The P-61 climbed to about 15,000 feet and began flying a patrol pattern designed to cover the routes that Japanese bombers would most likely use to approach their targets. The radar operator turned on his equipment and began scanning the darkness ahead, watching the glowing screen for any sign of enemy aircraft while the pilot flew steady and smooth to give the radar its best chance of detecting distant targets. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. Just the steady drone of engines and the green glow of the radar screen, showing nothing but ground returns from the islands below. Then suddenly, the radar operator called out contact, saying he had detected something at about 20 miles away, almost straight ahead, and at roughly their same altitude. The pilot immediately became more alert, focusing on his instruments and on the darkness ahead, while the radar operator studied the contact carefully to make sure it was real and not a false return. The contact looked exactly like what they were hoping to find, a single aircraft flying steady on a course toward American positions. The radar operator called out directions, and the pilot turned to an intercept heading, trusting completely in his radar operator's guidance, even though he himself could see absolutely nothing in the darkness ahead. The range began to decrease as the faster Black Widow closed in on the slower Japanese bomber. 20 miles became 15, then 10, then 5, as the pursuit continued, with the radar operator providing constant updates. At 3 miles, the pilot began straining his eyes to try to spot the target visually, knowing that at this range he should be able to see it if conditions were right. At 2 miles, he still saw nothing but darkness, but at 1 mile, he finally caught sight of a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky, and he could tell from its outline that it was definitely a Japanese bomber, probably a G4M that the Americans called Betty. The pilot carefully maneuvered his big Black Widow into position behind and slightly below the enemy bomber, placing himself in the perfect spot where his cannons would have a clear shot and where the Japanese crew was least likely to see him coming. The Japanese bomber flew steadily onward, its crew completely unaware that death was positioned just a few hundred yards behind them. The pilot took a moment to make sure his aim was perfect, lining up his gun sight on the center of the bomber's body. Then he pressed the firing button, and the 4 20mm cannons erupted with a sound like thunder, filling the darkness with bright flashes and sending a stream of explosive shells into the helpless Japanese aircraft. The effect was instant and terrible. The shells tore into the bomber's thin metal skin and exploded inside, shredding everything they touched. The pilot fired for only 3 seconds, but in that time his guns had sent dozens of explosive shells into the target. The bomber's right wing suddenly burst into flames as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited, creating a bright orange fireball that lit up the night. The blazing bomber began falling, trailing fire and pieces of wreckage, and within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness below, where it would crash into the ocean, taking its crew with it. The first kill had taken only minutes from initial radar contact to destruction, but there was no time to celebrate because the radar operator was already scanning for more targets. Within just minutes of destroying the first bomber, the radar operator called out another contact at about 15 miles on almost exactly the same course as the first one. The crew immediately realized they had found a stream of Japanese bombers, all heading toward the same target, separated by several miles to reduce their vulnerability, but following the same route. This was an incredible opportunity to inflict serious damage on the enemy, and the pilot turned toward the new contact while checking his fuel and ammunition, confirming he had plenty of both to continue fighting. The second interception proceeded smoothly, with the Black Widow closing in on its target using the same technique that had worked so well on the first bomber. The radar tracked steadily, the range decreased, and finally the pilot acquired the target visually and positioned for his attack. Once again, the 4 cannons roared, and once again a Japanese bomber was torn apart by explosive shells. This second bomber did not catch fire immediately, but instead nosed over into a steep dive, apparently with its pilot killed or its controls destroyed, and it plunged toward the ocean in a dive it would never recover from. The crew barely had time to mark the location of the second kill before the radar operator reported a third contact at 12 miles. The pattern was repeating with deadly efficiency, with the Black Widow using its radar eyes to find victims that had no idea they were being hunted, and then using its devastating firepower to destroy them in seconds. The pilot felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that each bomber they destroyed was one less enemy aircraft that could kill American soldiers and sailors, and he was determined to continue the attack as long as his fuel and ammunition lasted. The third interception required a bit more skill, because this bomber was flying lower than the others and was making gentle turns as if searching for landmarks. The pilot had to wait patiently for the right moment when the target steadied onto a straight course. Then he slid into position and fired. This time the bomber exploded in a massive fireball that was probably the most spectacular of all the kills, with burning fuel and debris scattered across the sky. The pilot had to turn sharply to avoid flying through the explosion, and as he turned away, he could see pieces of the bomber falling toward the water below. 3 Japanese bombers had been destroyed in less than an hour, but the night's work was not finished. The crew was tired from the intense concentration required for night combat, and the pilot's eyes hurt from staring into darkness and from being exposed to the bright flashes of his own guns and the burning bombers. The radar operator was fighting a headache from watching the glowing radar screen for so long. Both men knew their ammunition was getting low after 3 engagements, with each burst of cannon fire consuming dozens of shells. They had used more than half their ammunition and might have only enough left for one more attack. When the radar operator called out a 4th contact at 18 miles, the crew faced a decision. They could return to base having already accomplished more than anyone expected, or they could go after this 4th bomber, knowing they might not have enough ammunition to finish it if the attack did not go perfectly. They decided immediately to continue the hunt, driven by fighting spirit and by the knowledge that each enemy bomber they destroyed was one less threat to American lives. This final interception would be the hardest of the 4. As the range decreased, the radar operator noticed that this contact kept appearing and disappearing on his screen, suggesting it might be flying through clouds or maneuvering more actively. The pilot slowed down slightly to give his radar operator more time to maintain contact and to avoid overshooting the target. At 3 miles, the return became steadier, and the pilot prepared to acquire the target visually. When he finally spotted it at just under 1 mile, he immediately saw that this bomber was flying more erratically than the others, making small changes in altitude and heading that made positioning for a shot more difficult. Perhaps this crew had heard radio warnings about the other attacks, or perhaps they were just less experienced and flew less steadily. Either way, the pilot had to use all his skill to stay in position behind the maneuvering bomber, making constant small adjustments to his flight path. The pilot knew this had to count because he might not have enough ammunition for a second attempt. He waited with his finger on the trigger, watching through his gun sight as the target moved unpredictably through the darkness. Finally, the target straightened out for just a few seconds, and the pilot immediately squeezed the trigger, holding it down for a longer burst than before to make absolutely sure of the kill. The cannons hammered out their deadly fire, walking shells along the length of the bomber from tail to nose. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and the pilot wondered if somehow his ammunition had run out. But then the left engine burst into flames, and the left wing suddenly folded upward at an impossible angle, clearly having suffered catastrophic damage. The 4th bomber fell away trailing fire and pieces, obviously destroyed beyond any hope of survival. The crew turned for home, knowing they had accomplished something extraordinary. From first contact to the destruction of the 4th bomber, only 80 minutes had passed. 80 minutes that would change the course of the Pacific Air War and would finally convince even the most skeptical Japanese officers that the Black Widow was real and was deadly. The real story behind the 4 bombers destroyed in 80 minutes was not just about one crew's skill, but about technology that revolutionized warfare. The radar system in the Black Widow's nose represented years of scientific work by researchers who had labored to perfect the ability to detect aircraft electronically. The SCR-720 radar sent out radio waves that traveled through darkness as easily as light travels through air, bouncing off any metal object they encountered and returning to be detected and displayed on a screen. This technology gave the Black Widow the ability to see aircraft from miles away in conditions where human vision was useless. A skilled radar operator could track multiple targets, determine their altitude and speed, and guide his pilot to within firing range without ever seeing the enemy with his own eyes. The radar was not perfect and required considerable skill to use effectively, because it also showed confusing returns from the ground and from weather. But in trained hands, it was a war-winning capability that completely changed the balance of power in night combat. The other critical technology was the 20mm cannon, a weapon that combined range, accuracy, and destructive power in a way that machine guns could not match. Each explosive shell carried enough power to damage aircraft structure, destroy engines, and rupture fuel tanks, and the Black Widow carried 4 of these devastating weapons that could be fired together. When all 4 cannons fired simultaneously, they created a cone of destruction that could tear apart a bomber in seconds. Japanese aircraft like the G4M were particularly vulnerable because they lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, design choices that had been made to save weight and extend range, but that made the aircraft extremely fragile when hit. American pilots had learned that G4Ms would often explode when hit, earning the aircraft the grim nickname "one-shot lighter" because it took so little damage to turn one into a fireball. The combination of radar to find targets and powerful cannons to destroy them created a weapon system that gave the Americans overwhelming advantage in night combat. The mission that destroyed 4 Japanese bombers in 80 minutes became famous throughout the Pacific theater and was studied carefully by both American and Japanese military leaders. For Americans, it proved that the investment in developing the Black Widow and training specialized night fighter crews had been worthwhile, validating the entire concept of radar-equipped night fighters. The mission demonstrated that with the right technology and training, American forces could dominate the night sky just as completely as they dominated daytime operations, denying the enemy any sanctuary in darkness. The success led to increased emphasis on night fighting capabilities and to further improvements in radar technology and night fighting tactics. Other P-61 units tried to replicate the success of the 80-minute mission, and while few achieved such dramatic results, the Black Widow proved consistently effective at finding and destroying Japanese aircraft that operated at night. For the Japanese, the mission was a devastating blow to morale and to their ability to conduct effective night operations. The loss of 4 bombers and their experienced crews in a single mission was bad enough, but the psychological impact of knowing that darkness no longer provided protection was even worse. Japanese aircrew who had once felt confident flying at night now approached every mission with fear, always wondering if a Black Widow was somewhere in the darkness, watching them on radar and preparing to attack without warning. This fear affected performance and made some crews reluctant to fly, creating problems for commanders who needed to maintain operational tempo, but who could not force terrified men to fly missions they believed were suicidal. The Japanese response of reducing night operations and implementing defensive tactics essentially conceded American control of the night, which in turn made it harder for Japan to resist American advances and contributed to the overall collapse of Japanese defensive capabilities in the final months of the war. Behind the technology and tactics that enabled the destruction of 4 Japanese bombers in 80 minutes were human beings who faced fear, made split-second decisions, and performed their duties under enormous pressure. The American P-61 crew consisted of men who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in military aviation, knowing that night flying carried inherent risks beyond the danger from enemy action. These men had spent months training to work together as a seamless team, developing trust that allowed the pilot to follow his radar operator's directions, even when doing so seemed to contradict his own instincts. During the 80 minutes of combat, they remained calm and professional even as they destroyed target after target, methodically working through their procedures and making the complex task of night interception look routine, even though it was anything but routine. The physical and mental strain was enormous, with eyes straining to see in darkness, minds processing information constantly, and hands making precise control movements to position the aircraft perfectly for each attack. The Japanese bomber crews who died that night were also human beings, with families and hopes and dreams, men who were doing their duty as they understood it, and who believed they were serving their country honorably. They climbed into their aircraft that night with confidence based on many previous successful missions, never imagining that technology had made their standard tactics obsolete and that they were flying into a death trap created by an enemy they could not see and could not fight. The loss of these crews was mourned by their comrades and by their families back home in Japan, although the full circumstances of their deaths may not have been explained clearly because Japanese authorities did not want to spread panic about American night fighting capabilities. In the broader context of the war, these 4 bombers were a tiny fraction of the aircraft and lives lost by both sides, but for the individuals involved, each death represented the end of a unique human story and a tragedy for those who loved them. The mission that saw 4 Japanese bombers destroyed in 80 minutes stands as one of the most significant single engagements in the history of night air combat, demonstrating conclusively that technology and training had finally solved a problem that had plagued military aviation since the beginning. For thousands of years, darkness had been a shield that protected those who moved at night from those who hunted them, but the combination of radar and the purpose-built Black Widow stripped away that protection and made night as dangerous as day for enemy aircraft. The mission proved that American ingenuity and determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable, creating capabilities that enemies had dismissed as impossible until the evidence became undeniable. One crew flying 1 aircraft accomplished in 80 minutes what would have been impossible just a few years earlier, finding and destroying 4 separate targets in conditions of total darkness through the use of electronic eyes and devastating firepower.